Hello, everybody. It's me, Fee, or Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name. And I welcome you all to another chapter of my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story, and I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who have written such complimentary comments below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of my life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary, and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. Hello, everybody. It's me back again. Vicky, you know who I am. I'm sorry about missing a week. I've had flu, and it wasn't very nice. And there's no way I could have done any recording because I lost my voice. So I apologize for that. But I'm back, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and ready to tell you a bit more about our honeymoon in Mozambique. And we had got as far as we'd flown into Maputo, I think it's called now. Lorenzo Marques, beautiful city. So we'd booked in at the Polana, a lovely old colonial building. Now, some of you might remember it. It's still there, but it's in total ruin, absolutely depressingly. It's just a shell, literally a shell, after the Civil War, but it was beautiful then. In the very early 1970s, Mozambique was still very much a Portuguese colony, and the homesick settlers had built similar buildings to those in their home countries, as ours had done in South Africa. Here, one could have been overlooking the Med, but the architectural influence was pure Portuguese. The homes, shops, and hotels all had the same kind of flavour. There were red-tiled roofs, rough whitewash walls that reflected the blazing sunlight so fiercely that we were forced to wear our sunglasses every time we went outside. And there was bougainvillea everywhere in all colours imaginable, from maroon to scarlet to purple to magenta and bright pink. It climbed all over the buildings and walls everywhere and stood proudly in apricot yellow, peach pink, and ruby red hedges. I'd seen plenty of bougainvillea at home in all our towns and cities, and Mum had even managed to coax a magnificent specimen of eye-watering pink to grow up the walls of part of our house near the back veranda, where it was sheltered from our fierce winter frosts. But here it seemed to take over and blind you, and you couldn't put a pinhead between the strange papery flowers. There was not a green leaf to be seen between the flowers, as it was early summer, the best time to see them at their most prolific, and flower they did in profusion. As a contrast to all this, there was a soft green lawn surrounding a sparkling blue swimming pool. Our room was a spaciously airy one on the first floor, with its own deep, shady balcony overlooking the pool. We had an extended, lazy swim in the pristine water, and then picked delicious titbits from the sumptuous cold buffet laid out on the veranda. Diana had said to us that we wouldn't see much in the way of fresh fruit or salads at the hotel on Paradise Island, or Santa Carolina, as the Portuguese call it. Elem was known throughout South Africa as having the best prawns and langoustines on the subcontinent. At home, every good hotel and restaurant worth their salt boasted of having fresh Elem seafood on their menus. The Hotel Polana's gigantic buffet table had ice sculptures all down the middle as elaborate centerpieces, as well as carved watermelon baskets filled with exotic and delicious-looking cubed fruit salads, and everything was beautifully garnished with colourful, edible decorations. There were huge piles of crayfish tails on enormous platters, and great tubs of the finest Mozambique prawns and langoustines, with big glass jugs of seafood sauces as well as mayonnaises and salad dressings on the side. There were huge whole grilled fish of what looked like every species found in the Indian Ocean, most of them about 3 feet long, wonderfully presented and served either hot or cold. We enjoyed the presentation of this feast, but not being particularly hungry after the full English breakfast we'd gorged on that morning in Joburg, we ate quite sparingly, knowing we'd be served an a la carte dinner that evening, as our stay was all inclusive. Afterwards, we returned to our pleasantly cool room to sleep off the heat of the day. The following morning, after another big breakfast, we climbed into a taxi provided by the hotel and set off back to the airport. Our driver this time was far more circumspect than our previous one, the mad, bearded, beret Che Guevara, and we travelled a lot more slowly instead of swerving wildly all over the road. So once we'd left the suburbs, I had a better look at the squatter settlements, crammed cheek by jowl all over the airport road. At the Polana, I noticed that even their African staff, mainly waiters, porters, and cleaner, had been, without exception, very thin and emaciated compared to our Zulus, Basutus, and Xhosas. They were also so very startlingly pitch black, whereas the Africans I was used to were brown, and even then varied in shades to almost yellow in the case of some of the Xhosas I'd come across in the Eastern Cape, who still carried strong Khoisan genes in their blood, a bit like Mandela. I knew almost nothing about Mozambique, mostly what I'd learnt in history at school. The area was explored by Vasco da Gama in 1498 and colonized by Portugal in 1505. The only official language of Mozambique was Portuguese, with roughly half the population speaking it as a second language. The meagre population of white people spoke it as a first language. Between the 1st and 5th centuries AD, the Portuguese Africans had originally migrated from farther north and west, and I'd read somewhere that Swahili and later Arab commercial ports existed along the coasts until the arrival of Europeans. One could see the Arab influence in the features of the local people. They had longer faces, slightly longer hair, and long straight noses rather than the flatter, more negroid ones of our own South African blacks. But they were so thin, all of them. I searched in vain, casting my eyes left and right, peering at the slums alongside, trying to see if I could spot just one plump person. Perhaps a woman who would look like a darker version of Evelina, my old nanny. But there was nobody who wasn't almost a walking skeleton. I'd had it dinned into me after I'd spent some time in Europe and the UK that our poor African people were being starved and ill-treated by the apartheid government, and I'd begun to try and look at them with new eyes. But with very few exceptions, our Zulu women were both plump and buxom. The men, too, especially those who had more sedentary jobs, like Ngiti, our headman, Nduna, who oversaw rather than doing too much in the way of manual labour, was positively rotund. I racked my brains trying to picture any of our farm staff who'd ever been even remotely as thin as these Portuguese Africans, but I couldn't. The countryside we'd flown over looked exactly like that of the Kruger National Park, South Africa's biggest game reserve. I published this book for people all over the world, so I had to do a bit of explaining. I could have left that out. This was not a surprise, as Mozambique shares a border the length of Wales with our famous national park. Along the coast, it consisted of very fine sandy soil, which was almost white, and was scattered rather sparsely with thorn trees, the flat-topped acacia umbrella trees, as we'd always called them. There was very little in the way of grazing, other than patchy, very short green grass roots that had sprung up here and there after the veldt had been burned off, probably by a natural bushfire, usually started by lightning striking a dry tree and setting it and the surrounding area ablaze, or by hunters trying to flush out game by setting fire to the long grass, as had been the case ever since time began. There were certainly no signs of any form of agriculture, and I didn't see any indications that there was water either in rivers, dams, or waterholes. The terrain was parched, bone dry by the intense and fierce heat. That would explain the huddle of poverty-stricken humans around the very outer perimeters of the city. There was nothing for them or their livestock to eat or drink out there, and they would have had to migrate towards the city to try and glean some sort of existence off the periphery, perhaps doing menial jobs that earned them enough money to buy a little food and supplies from stores in LM. There seemed to be very little difference between the segregated areas I was used to in apartheid South Africa and here, although there was no legislation to say where people could live. It appeared to be pretty much the same. Well-to-do whites lived in the city and suburbs, and blacks in what looked like attractive and comfortable homes. And there was this huge discrepancy here, where the neat whitewashed houses ended and the squatter shacks began. There was no in-between. The slums went on forever. We were separated from them by 10-foot high razor-wire topped barbed wire fences around LM Airport, and they continued beyond as far as the eye could see. The desiccated wasteland we'd flown over when we'd arrived in LM the day before explained a lot about why the people were so thin, why their beasts were so emaciated. Even the goats were just skin and bone. What did these people live on? I was glad to walk into the cool, dark airport building away from all that human misery and follow our porter to a grassed area where a small four-seater Sun Air plane stood waiting. Our bags, the boat, and other bits and pieces had been loaded onto the old wooden trolley on casters, and we stood in the sun and watched as the porter, with some difficulty, loaded them into the hold. It was a snug fit. We'd been warned by the travel agent with whom Fred had booked our holiday to Mozambique that we would be allowed to take only one small, soft canvas bag each, and now we saw why. There was a swarthy Portuguese white man in a khaki uniform of shorts and shirt, with the same Sun Air logo on his epaulettes. He hurried over and introduced himself in Portuguese. This was our pilot. He didn't have chili powder in his eyes. No, he had a streaming cold and kept pulling out a rather grubby-looking handkerchief into which he sneezed wetly and copiously at intervals, as he did a very brief and cursory pre-flight check. He indicated us to climb in, and Fred and I exchanged glances. Who was going to sit nearest this guy as he coughed, sneezed, not always into the hanky or his hand, and who sniffed ripely now and again? I climbed up the wing and into the back seat, and Fred took the co-pilot's seat in front, as there was more room for his long legs. The space inside the hot little plane was about the same as that of a Volkswagen Beetle, and we three were crammed in at very close quarters to the cold germs which our pilots sprayed out continuously, splattering the inside of the cockpit windscreen. I quickly slid my tiny side window back so as to let in as much fresh air as I could, and I saw Fred do the same as we took off, bumping over the uneven, sandy grass and up into the air. My heart soared along with the little plane as we climbed and banked over the slums before setting a course along the coastline. We were flying really low now, and I got a much better look at the country below us. The shore was absolutely dead straight, with snowy white sand, and the flat, calm sea was a transparent turquoise blue. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Moslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.